家好，我是 Penny。那现在呢，距香港国安法通过也有1个半月的时间了。那之前呢，新民党创始人叶刘淑仪在接受经济学家杂志采访的时候说到呢，这个香港国安法是为了震慑那些勾结外国势力的人士而制定的。那随着黎智英等人被捕呢，我们也真正看到了这种威慑力在香港的街头上上演。那今天呢，我们就来听一听经济学家杂志内部人员对香港国安法是否对一国两制有着违背初衷的一些影响而做的讨论。那我们现在就去听一听吧。
On Monday, police in Hong Kong marched through the offices of a local tabloid called Apple Daily and arrested its influential owner, Jimmy Lai. He was charged with colluding with foreign forces, a crime that carries a potential life sentence. Agnes Chow, a prominent youth activist, and 8 others were also arrested under the same law. All were released on bail yesterday. The arrests confirm the fears of pro-democracy campaigners that Hong Kong's freedoms are disappearing. On July 1st, the territory's chief executive, Carrie Lam, unveiled a new national security law imposed by Beijing. Activists worried about a broader clampdown on a city that has recently seen so much feverish activism, protests, and riots. But Mrs. Lam promised Hong Kongers would still be free to express themselves.
It is clearly stated in Article 4 that people of Hong Kong, they should be able to continue to enjoy the freedom of speech, freedom of press, of publications, protests, assembly, and so on and so on.
Increasingly, that promise rings hollow.
Jimmy Lai was arrested with some high drama.
David Rennie writes Chagwan, The Economist's column on Chinese affairs, and it's based in Beijing.
We saw police searching his very large and expensive home, and then he was led with his hands handcuffed behind his back around his own newspaper offices, accompanied by 200 police officers in uniform who seized dozens of boxes of material and threatened journalists who were live streaming the whole very dramatic scenes. He's been charged with collusion with foreign forces, seditious words, and fraud, and all of those crimes are crimes under the new national security law, which Beijing imposed on Hong Kong 6 weeks ago.
And why is his arrest so remarkable?
Well, in many ways, he's a kind of typical heroic rags-to-riches Hong Kong tycoon. He, like many Hong Kongers, was born on the mainland in the province just across the border, Guangdong. He was a stowaway on a boat into Hong Kong, age 12. He got a job in a garment factory. He worked his way up. He traded stocks, got rich, started a company that eventually became the fashion company Giordano. But he also got politics along the way. And so, in particular, the very brutal suppression of the democracy protests in and around Tiananmen Square in June 1989 really kind of changed his worldview, and he became much more political. Once he became much more political, he started to suffer business losses and eventually sold his fashion company because the Chinese shops were being effectively boycotted. He has used his raucous tabloid newspaper empire to launch very severe political attacks on his opponents in Hong Kong, on political leaders in the mainland. And he has also, and this is why he's now facing these charges, he has gone to places like Washington and said to senior political figures in the Trump administration, other capitals, that they should sanction the government in Hong Kong, that it's foreign pressure that can make a difference. And that, since the new national security law was passed, is deemed a serious crime of collusion with foreign powers. He faces potentially life in prison.
And he's not the only one who's fallen foul of this law.
No, that's right. In addition to 2 of his own sons who are being charged with fraud, we've seen some prominent members of the pro-democracy movement, in particular Agnes Chow, who's 23. She's a kind of really a very popular figure among pro-democracy activists, also very popular in Japan because she speaks Japanese, and so she's been front-page news in Japan. Again, what is so shocking is that the party that she co-founded, Demosisto, was wound up specifically in order to try and give them some immunity against the national security law. But the police who arrested her told her that apparently the fact that she had been saying on social media that foreigners should help Hong Kong was in itself a breach of the law. One of the other co-founders of Demosisto, Nathan Law, who is in exile now in the UK, he has also apparently been charged, and if he went back to Hong Kong, would clearly be locked up. Joshua Wong, perhaps the most famous of that young generation of very young activists, still remains unarrested for the moment, although he faces other charges, but he's still at large and tweeting and giving interviews.
And in the meantime, how have these arrests gone down among Hong Kong's people?
There's been a big response in Hong Kong, and not that long ago, you could have expected public protests. Remember, we had hundreds of thousands of people on the streets for weeks last summer. Since the new national security law has been passed, that kind of public activity is much too dangerous. People are even too scared to say what they feel on social media. So we're seeing subtle signs of support, and one of the most obvious ones is that Apple Daily, the tabloid owned by Jimmy Lai, has been increasing its print run sort of ninefold to more than 500,000 copies, which instantly sold out. His share price has shot up because people are buying the shares to show support. A restaurant owned by his family has had long queues outside. People are basically too frightened to voice political opinions, but they're showing that there are still a lot of people who want to show their support.
So it sounds as if Beijing's new law is having the intended effect.
It's a very depressing moment, really. I mean, all of us who covered the protests last year were very, very struck by the cross-section of Hong Kong society who were expressing real kind of contempt for the mainland government, real hostility to the idea of Hong Kongers potentially facing trial in mainland courts. And there was a sense that the hearts and minds of Hong Kong were being lost last year, and that Hong Kong was showing extraordinary defiance. What's kind of depressing now is that this new national security law shows that Beijing is willing to use really extraordinary, visible tools of legal repression to shut down that kind of opposition spirit in Hong Kong. And, you know, in terms of public protest, it's probably going to work because this law has been incredibly carefully drafted. It's incredibly vague, it's incredibly broad, and it's self-enforcing in this very sinister way.
How so? What do you mean by that?
We're seeing members of the opposition, the pro-democracy opposition, banned, for example, from running for public office because they said that the law was a bad idea, and that apparently to say that the law is not needed is against the law. To say that as a pro-democracy politician, if elected, you would vote against government policies is now enough to get you banned. So we're seeing really that old promise of one country, two systems that the mainland government held out after Britain handed Hong Kong back in 1997 at incredible speed. That is becoming much more like one country, one system. And that raucous, noisy freedom of the press, freedom of expression, the right to protest that people remember, the hundreds of thousands who protested all last summer, all of that is now illegal and punishable by a brand new secret police force. And in the case of people like Jimmy Lai, potentially being hauled across the border to the mainland to face trial in a communist-controlled court and then potentially life imprisonment, simply for saying that foreigners should put pressure on the government to preserve Hong Kong's freedoms. That's how far we've gone in such a short time.
But I'm just wondering, when this law was first announced, there was talk of how it might spark actually more resistance, that enforcing it might draw in the international community. But it's quiet, as you say, inside and certainly outside Hong Kong. It's been smooth sailing for this law.
Yeah, because this matters more to Beijing than it matters to us. When it's like when the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia and Hungary, it mattered more to them than it did to the world. We weren't going to fight a war over it. So, I mean, we'll see, will Britain hold out the welcome? How many Hong Kongers will leave? How many will take up the passport offer? But no, it'll work, because that's the thing about being a brutal dictatorship, is if you're willing to shrug off international condemnation, it will work. And international bankers, probably lots of them, are silently quite pleased to see these troublemakers locked up.
Thanks very much for joining us, David.
Thank you.